know your options, because Cambridge opens a lot of doors, and it opens a lot of really, really special and impactful doors too. And so I think that that's something that doesn't get enough attention during the time you're there, and because you're so busy and because you sort of just have these simple objectives in mind. But it's something that definitely would have changed both how I approached my degree, as far as the trying to use it more holistically, as well as my understanding of what I could do with that degree.
Hi everyone, this is the Oxford and Cambridge project. I'm Opportune Simon, and today we have Krishna Ramesh with us. Krishna is a development economist currently living in Zambia and working on policymaking across the African continent. He graduated with a bachelor's degree in economics from Cambridge in 2016 and with a master's degree from Yale in 2017. Krishna is from Botswana and in high school secured a scholarship from the government of Botswana that funded all further secondary and tertiary education. He went to Downing College during his time at Cambridge. Hi, Krishna. It's so good to have you on.
Hello, it's great to meet you, and thanks for having me.
Well, thank you for being here. You're currently joining us from Lusaka in Zambia. How is the COVID situation there?
Yeah, things here are, I guess, comparatively okay. Sort of through most of last year, it was better than we thought, as far as the COVID situation. So sort of certain components of life were relatively normal, but still with being careful, which I think was the important part. Now we're going through a bit of a second wave, and so it's still sort of working from home. It's still being sort of careful in who you interact with, and sort of limiting the people that you deal with. But as far as places to be stuck, it's not too bad. You can still travel a little bit. You can still go out into national parks and get some space. So can't complain too much.
Nice. That sounds dreamy. It's currently raining very hard in the UK, so I'm wishing I was there. And Krishna, we just have a quick fire round to start you off. We normally start with a little more background on you, but that'll come after. This is just a couple questions. I said a few questions. Don't tell us your reasoning, just flow with the answer. Okay, so Krishna, let's start. What's your favorite spot at Downing College?
The paddock.
What's your least favorite part of economics?
The maths.
What's your best study spot in Cambridge?
Probably the Downing Library or the cafe.
And do you prefer a formal or the Lord Butterfield bar?
Oh, the Lord Butterfield bar. Although sadly it's under renovation right now, I hear.
And is it Tinder or Netflix?
Netflix.
Is it Cambridge or Yale?
Cambridge. Let's go with Cambridge.
Good answer. And then just to finish it off, I have a study, marry, ban. So kind of like the kiss, marry, kill for the colleges of Cambridge. Where would you prefer to study? Where would you marry if you have a wedding ceremony? And which college would you just ban altogether from Cambridge?
Study, I'd probably stick with Downing. Marry, John's is pretty, as much as I hate to say it. And ban, Churchill is less pretty, as much as people from Churchill probably hate to say it.
Just going for it. We love that. That's great. Thank you so much, Krishna. And now I am happy to ask you more about your background. So can you just tell us about your life, growing up in Botswana, and when did you think about applying to Cambridge, and how did that amazing scholarship go through? Just tell us more about that.
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, I was born and brought up in Botswana. Very sort of fantastic place to grow up. I think it was just So my family moved there originally. Family was previously from India, and then I sort of grew up there. And I think sort of growing up, we thought a little bit about going to university abroad and that type of thing, but it wasn't particularly front of mind. I think education wise, the importance was just sort of a holistic education, just being broad in how you go about things. And I think the general approach to how things work in Botswana is just sort of get as wide a range of skills as possible, both during school, which was a much more like laid back approach to school, and was sort of heavy on studies, but then also on things like sport and doing other things out of school. So while I was at school, I did until my basically GCSE, so IGCSEs in Botswana. And then after that was when this scholarship came along. And so I was really fortunate. Basically, the Botswana government was sponsoring a certain set of students from the country to pursue further education abroad. And so as a result of that, which was a bit of a surprise because it was a pretty new program when in my year, a group of us from home went to the UK to do our A-levels. And so while I was at home sort of doing up until my sort of grade 10 or my IGCSEs, when I was thinking about university, America was much more front of mind as far as like where I wanted to go. I think it was just the nature of the school and also where a lot of people had gone from the school that I went to. But once I went to the UK and once I sort of entered sixth form there, it was a much more natural process. And so that's when I started thinking about UK unis. Still was pretty open-minded in terms of where I wanted to go. I didn't have strong preferences, but it was, as things went and given the support that we got at the school that I was at, I figured, why not try? And so that's sort of what led me to Cambridge. It was, I guess, a few different lucky breaks followed by each other, along with sort of a lot of support through the process, both in terms of the like opportunity side through the scholarship, as well as sort of the facilitation side through the like support and the system itself. Once you get to the UK, made it a lot easier to just make that process happen. And so that's sort of what took me to Cambridge in the end.
Nice. And you did end up going to the US to study anyway, so you kind of got the best of both worlds there. What led you to study economics then at university?
Yeah, it was also a little bit sort of figure it out as I went. I think growing up, I mentioned maths was the part I enjoyed the least about the economics degree, but it was the part I enjoyed the most sort of growing up. I think I was always a quantitative person as far as the subjects that I enjoyed through school and what I liked to do. And so when I was doing both my sort of GCSEs and my A-levels, the more like sciencey, economicsy subjects were front of mind. And then I think when I was thinking about what I wanted to do post-uni, I still didn't have a clear idea in mind, but I knew that I wanted to come back near home. I knew that I wanted to contribute and sort of basically add some value. And when I was thinking about the best ways to achieve that, sort of policy and the international development space stood out. And so I think really the way that I ended up in economics was just what sort of skill sets are valuable, what sort of skill sets are broad enough such that you can go in a range of different directions, but still provide a little bit of that like quantitative support. And I get to do some of the things that at that point I thought I enjoyed doing as far as the mathsy side of things. So that's what led me to economics. And then sort of led me into, while I was at Cambridge, sort of pushing more into the development economic space as I learned a little bit more and sort of formulated where I wanted to go after that.
Nice, yeah, makes sense. And do you remember at all that sort of interview part and just, I guess, the whole application process? You mentioned that you were doing quite like sciencey, I guess, A-levels and mathy.
Yeah, it was a strange one. I mean, I think the personal statement was just weird thing to write. I think usually in the sense of, one, I don't like writing about myself, but two, it's just not something you're ever used to doing. And so I think that was the sort of workshopping and just revisiting the same 1 page or 2 page thing again and again and again was a bit of a process. But I appreciated the fact in the UK as opposed to US, sort of you focus on this one thing, right? You focus on sort of building out your application, and then it's a sort of similar process to across a range of schools. So I think in terms of that initial application process, it was very different to what I was used to, but I actually enjoyed it. It gave me an opportunity to bring out some of the more like holistic components of particularly how I grew up and education back home. And then the interview was strange. It was tough. I only had one interview because for economics, I think, well, Cambridge was the only place I interviewed. Everywhere else didn't require an interview. I'd never been to Cambridge before. So I remember getting there and just being like, what is this place? This is very different to anything I've ever seen. I remember going into Downing and first thinking this is really pretty, but then also just wondering what era I was in as far as like the buildings and everything that was around me. So I think the surroundings were a little bit intimidating, but I ended up really enjoying the conversation. I think I had 2 interviews. They were tough. I'll never forget being shown like a really weird picture of something that looked like a rabbit and a duck, and we were talking about theories and sort of demand and supply, and there were all sorts of things going on. But I really enjoyed the just intellectual conversation. I think that's the piece coming out of it. During it, you're obviously scared, but coming out of it, it's sort of a feeling of like, yeah, I feel like this is a place where I would enjoy myself on the intellectual side, because it's a place where you can talk about the things that you think about, and that got me excited.
Definitely. And did you know at the time that Downing has a reputation to be like a very big college for economists, and it's actually like, I would say there's probably more competition if you want to do econ at Downing?
I didn't. So again, when it came to college choice, I looked very little into the like subject component of things and looked a lot more into just like what environment would I enjoy. And so that's what led me to Downing. It was, again, it's a lot of serendipitous components of this journey, but it was, again, just a result of a conversation with someone else who was thinking about applying to Cambridge, who'd done a lot of research into it. And we were just talking about what the different pros and cons of each college. And so that's what led me to apply. I remember looking at the application requirements, and there was this maths test that we had to do, which was very different to other colleges. But it was a case of, if I get in, it's going to be a challenging process to get in, regardless of which college I apply to. Where would I rather spend my time? And I think that's sort of what ultimately led to that decision of going for Downing. And after that is when I realized or heard about the fact that it is going to be a little bit more competitive than, well, I anticipated it to be competitive, but more competitive than other places when it comes to economics.
Definitely. And so I guess when you got your obviously positive answer, where were you? Were you in the UK or like with your family or?
Yeah, I was back home in Botswana, and so I know they usually post responses, but I was like, please don't post the response because I'm not going to get a response anytime soon. And so I'd asked the college to email me with the response. And so yes, I was back home. It was during the Christmas break, and it was fantastic. I mean, I was super pleased. I think like I wasn't heavily anchoring to a specific place in my mind, but I knew that I really liked the environment that was Cambridge, as far as sort of a smaller city, a place where I can really push myself. And so, yeah, I was super happy. My parents were super happy, and it was just a lot of excitement. A few of my friends from the program, from the similar scholarship program, also from Botswana, made it in as well for different courses. And so it was just really cool to know that you immediately had a group of people there. So yeah, it was a great moment. I got the actual hard copy acceptance letter 6 months after I joined in my pigeonhole, which had bounced back in the post.
Oh my God.
So
right.
the email was a good shout, but yeah, it was big. I think like through that process, or like growing up, there's always a natural step-by-step process as far as what you do and what you do next. And I think going to uni is the one big step, right? And the step that you really like work towards a lot. And so that was a proud moment.
It's so good to like hear that you knew you had some friends going in as well, because I feel like that's something that a lot of people don't have, and I definitely don't have. And I was just like my freshers week was a blur because I was so scared to go out and meet people. I couldn't understand people with their different like British accents, and I was just like, I know no one here. So I'm guessing you had a better freshers week experience than me. How did like taking to, I guess, yeah, the first few weeks, the first term really is generally one of the hardest. How
Yeah.
did that rhythm get along?
It was tough. I remember Freshers Week I really enjoyed. I think like yeah, I knew a few people there. It was a great opportunity to meet more people. It was a lot of culture shock as far as like I spent 2 years in Wales before that for my sixth form, but there was a group of us who were there together as a very international school. And so like coming in as an international student to Cambridge and just sort of meeting a lot more British people than I'd ever met in my life. It like took a little bit of time to get used to everything, right? Getting used to the like institutional structure that is Cambridge, which is different and very unique. Getting used to the people you meet and just sort of being tossed into this environment. So we had an international freshers week, which was really, really cool at the start because it was just a great way to meet people who are in the same boat, who are dealing with the same challenges as you. And then you go into the normal freshers week, which is so much more overwhelming. And you still, again, like have a little bit of that. I mean, you've known each other for 3 days, but you still have a little bit more of that like group. And so that's what helped me a lot through the first term as far as jumping into everything. You sort of, well, I was definitely like, if you're going to meet people, you have to be a bit of a yes man. You have to do everything that you can to just like understand what you like doing and what you don't like doing, because alongside everything else, you're also just growing a hell of a lot as an individual. And so I think that it was a whirlwind on everything else. On the academic side, it was intense. Is probably the easiest way to put it. It was definitely a big shift. I think everybody feels that big shift where you go from sort of environments that you're relatively more comfortable in, that you're used to, and you jump into this place and you're just like surrounded by astoundingly intellectual people. And you're sort of jumping straight into a course and a program that's designed in a way that's way more independent than anything you've ever done. And so it's sort of just a case of like, whoa, what's going on? This is weird. But relying on the people who you're, again, are in the same boat as you and are going through the same things and sort of making it work together. But it definitely on the work side took me a while to just understand firstly what I wanted to get out of it, and just pick my head up from the day-to-day madness and stress, and then secondly to get used to or to acclimatize to the expectations from sort of all the components of the academic side of what you're doing.
Definitely. And I guess like you obviously know so much about economics, like I'll put it like that, just because with a BA degree from Cambridge and a master's in economics from Yale, you would expect that. What are your tips for, I guess, students who are looking to apply to university to study economics? What kind of like skills do they need to develop in high school?
Mm.
And also, I guess, when they're there and they need to adapt to that huge shift in expectations,
Mm.
what tips would you give to your past self, I guess?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I've thought about this a lot and spoken to a lot of people since about this. I think as far as the first part, when you're going in, I think there's three really important things. I think the first one is, and this is really hard to do because you're 16, 17, 18, and you're trying to figure this all out and you have to pick a degree right off the bat, which is sort of very different to a lot of other educational systems. But it's just asking yourself why, right? And I think like if you understand even the world of opportunities that you might be interested in, and then that comes across very quickly in your personal statement, in your interviews, and whatever it may be, as far as like why you've decided your passion, and even if it's not a passion yet, your what you want to get out of the program. So I think that's one thing that I often say is just sort of like think deeply about you're investing a lot of your time into this, as far as the next 3 years of your life, and most people only do one undergrad. So think deeply about sort of what motivates you to do economics. Secondly is try and be as holistic as possible. As far as I mean, Cambridge economics is very straight and narrow as far as what you do, and the program itself. But I do think that showing that broader level of interest through reading, through just like thinking about economic issues of the time, is really, really important, because again, it shows that desire to take what you're studying and apply it in real life. And I think that's a really valuable thing, when both to inform your approach when you're doing the program, as well as to make your application attractive. And then I think the third one, which is the boring one, which is why I left it for last, is just like push really hard on the quantitative subjects. Like, as much as I don't yet know how I feel about this, I've formulated opinions over time, but it's obviously very academically oriented. It's obviously really important to show that you're very capable on the maths front. And so when you're thinking about the subjects that you're doing at A level, when you're thinking about sort of places you want to be focusing, I think it's just important to, again, just tick that box, for lack of a better term, as far as just sort of being confident in showcasing those abilities from a grades perspective. And then I think the important part is, once you've showcased those abilities from a grades perspective, how do you then, both for yourself and for your application, take that interest to a much more broad and applicable level, or in reality. So I think those are the three things that stand out when applying. And then I think the big thing when you've got in and when you're going there is, the most important thing for me, especially at the start, was understand what you're aiming for. It's very easy to get pulled into the competitiveness. It's very easy to get pulled into comparing yourself with people around you. And there's some value in that, in the sense of you have to push yourself. But especially at the start, while you're settling in, there's also a lot of value in giving yourself a little bit of space, because of the fact that you're getting used to so many things, especially if you're coming in as an international, more generally, but particularly if you're coming in and this is a new environment, you're getting used to so many things all at once. And so I think that's a big one, which was just sort of set your own expectations for what you're aiming for, and base those expectations on what you want to achieve for yourself, as opposed to things around rankings and whatnot. And I was having a conversation with a mate who was at Cambridge earlier this morning, and I mean, you hear this all the time, but I think it's not something you necessarily hear from powers that be while you're there. And so I think it's important to remind yourself of, and something that I found really, really valuable. And then I think the second thing is, and this builds off what I said when applying, is try as much as possible to relate what you're doing to the bigger picture. It's often really hard when you're doing very theoretical things, but that's what you're studying it for, right? Like, the purpose of what you're doing this degree for is to take at least some of that skill set and put it in place in the rest of your life. And so I think the other thing that I found really helpful, and what gravitated me towards development economics, was just the opportunity to, even if it's just like, I mean, there's the age-old question of, when on earth am I going to use this? But even if it's like looking at the news and thinking about the news, it definitely like changed the way I thought about the news when I'd studied certain things in macroeconomics, for example. And so that's the other thing that helped contextualize my degree a lot for me, was just continually keeping in mind what this is going to feed towards. And why I found this so interesting, particularly at times when you can very easily get stuck in, oh man, I have to finish this problem set, or I have to go to the supervision, or like there's this formula that I really can't figure out for the life of me.
Yeah, no, that's such a great compilation of tips. Thank you for that. I feel like you've definitely thought about it a lot. Yeah, all of these were amazing. I'm just remembering when you mentioned the, obviously, comparing yourself and the rankings and stuff. That's something that Cambridge and Oxford have just been like really bad at, like not great for mental health. It just, if we pick one reason, the rankings that are like published for everyone to see. But obviously that has recently changed, and I can't remember if you opt out or if it's just they don't publish it anymore and they just send you your grades to you. But at least there's that, which helps with the less comparing yourself. But even colleges are really prone to that, because if you've got multiple people in your course, like your psyche is just bound to compare yourself with the people in the same level as you. So yeah, it's definitely hard, and it's already a new world. Like you can't expect to adapt quickly. So yeah, very interesting. And you really applied your studies, like even if they were more theoretical from Cambridge, into your career, first of all, but also in between your job and Cambridge, you went to do a master's. So why did you feel the need to go for another degree?
Yeah, this is a question I grappled with a lot, especially at that time. I think I'd say probably three big things. The first one is I wasn't particularly interested in working in the city, or sort of working in the consulting and banking space. And
which is really industries that like Cambridge ushers you to, like, oh my God, yeah.
Yeah, and longer conversation for sure. But I think feeds into that point around like keeping the big picture in mind and comparing yourself to where you want to be as opposed to where you're told you should be. But I think that was a big one. So I wasn't super keen on being in the city. I wasn't entirely affixed to remaining in England and immediately working in England. And I knew I wanted to work in the development space. And so that was step one, is like, if I'm not going to go the conventional route that we're often told to go as students of economics at Cambridge, what am I going to do instead? I think step two was thinking about, ways to get into the international development space and what's needed. And often what came out of that was having a master's degree is really valuable. And so it was from the perspective of like, what do I need to be where I want to be? Like having that master's degree was a really helpful way to basically open a few more doors as far as next steps for me. And again, I was really fortunate because thanks to this government scholarship, it was still funded, and so I had the opportunity to do it, which was huge. And then I'd say the third one for me was just diversity of experience has been a huge cornerstone of my life so far, and it was as far as just like pushing for as many different experiences as possible. And that was a big thing when I was thinking about that next step. Is I applied for a few programs in the UK as well, but really I was going to, how can I get as different experience as possible? I've seen what this UK university experience looks like at its most extreme form. How do I see what the opposite side of the spectrum looks like, as far as like, there's so many differences between UK and US institutions, but one of the big ones is the like holistic approach. And I think a combination is valuable, but for me, so for me, it was like, I want to spend some time in the US. It's a very different place. I've never been there. I'd been there before, but I'd never lived there. I want to go to a very different type of institution. It's still similar in the sense of ivory tower institution, but it's just like grounded in a very different narrative. So I want to go to a different place. And so that's really what pushed me towards specifically looking to the US for that master's degree, was where can I see as diverse a experience as possible in terms of the things I get to study, being able to move outside of just like core economics, the people I get to meet, the experiences that I get, the places I get to see. And so I'd say those three things are like what drove me in the direction of that master's program. Part of it was probably also delaying the next step, but I'd sort of seen it as and it ended up being like a really valuable like interim step, because that's what then I think led to a lot of the consequent opportunities in terms of work, and also in terms of, I think, shaped a lot of both how I see Cambridge positively and negatively, as well as how I see how I see like the university experience or the value of like tertiary education.
It's good that you say, obviously, like remembering Cambridge both positively and negatively, because I feel like a lot of us, when we got through it, we're just like looking back at it through like rose tinted glasses, but we need to obviously warn the next generation of like the things that are to come and how like hard it is, and the importance of taking time for yourself and not to just punish yourself for every single mistake, because you're going to make a lot and it's life, and that's what being a student at university is.
I think that the way I think about it is exactly that. It's, would I change it? No. Do I regret it? No. Are there things that I learned over the course of that time which would have made me enjoy it more if I'd applied those through the whole 3 years? Yes. And I think like that framing, both coming in as well as like once you've left, is, I found really helpful to just like ground that experience, which was, in the moment, it's obviously you're in the moment and it's tough and it's like, it's fun and it's painful at the same time. But when you come out of it, you also get, it's all growth. Both sides of it are growth.
So looking back at your university experience, was there anything apart from your degree that you took part of in Cambridge?
Yeah, so sport was a really big thing for me. That's my like getaway. And so, yeah, like college football, college squash, college cricket, just like so things that were not super serious, but allowed me to get away from things, was something that I valued a lot. And then like a few other societies, was involved in the India Society, was involved in the JCR, and just like other small things here and there that again just like diversified my experience. I think that was a big value add of those pieces, was allowing you to interact with people who are not just your little bubbles of course in college. And therefore, it's funny, we don't think about, I guess you do think about work-life balance a lot at Cambridge, but you think about it in a different way, where I think even like breaking out of those little circles is valuable. So yeah, sport was a big one, and then a few different societies. The union was another one, as far as just like watching debates, participating in debates, and speaking and thinking was another big value add for me, where again, it's like you're in this really cool environment where you're surrounded by people who are thinking about everything. And so
Yeah,
it's fun to talk about everything at the same time.
I love how you're just saying like, oh, just little things here and there, but for most people, if you're part of like the JCR, that's like the whole thing. The only thing you do. If you do like sports, that's also the only thing you do. But you know, you just seem to have been able to manage it all. How do you feel like you spent your time? How did you like balance all these responsibilities?
Yeah, I mean, the answer is probably in the moment not very well. But I think I think a few things fed into it. I think the first one is understanding what I wanted to get out of the academic side. So how much value there is for me personally of, you're still pushing yourself really, really hard, but how much value is there for me personally from pushing myself, that spending that extra 10% of time to get that extra 2% of progress. So I think that was one, which took a while to realize, and I probably didn't fully realize until I'd left, but I think helped. I think the second one was, yeah, just like splitting things out. You have 3 years, you have many terms, you have lots of time. Like all of these different things I mentioned, like there were not many of them, for better or for worse, where I was like very heavily involved. And so that allowed me to get a little bit more of that breadth, where I'd be like, yeah, this term I'm going to play squash, next time I'm going to be part of the society, or like be more active in the society. So I think spreading things out, we have short terms, but you do still have 9 of them. Well, exam term doesn't count, but you have a decent chunk of them.
I feel like exam term could count, especially if you're just looking to do sports and like take your mind off exam. So
that's true. Yeah, that was really helpful for me. So I'd say like those two things made a difference. And then I think like, yeah, I often got stuck into it and overwhelmed by it, but you surround yourself with good people who can reality check you and who you can reality check. And that's such a big part of it too, right? Where you do have people who can say, come on, like you're spending way too long in the library, what are you doing? Or like go do something else. And I think that's also something that helped through that whole process, because you sometimes need that reminder. It is easy to get stuck into the go go go.
definitely. And for this like friendship group that you have, did you feel like it was a lot of people from your college, or was it others that you said you were with when you had your secondary education?
Yeah, it was a combination of both. I think I was very close with a lot of people from the college. I think fundamentally that's the wonderful thing about colleges, right? This is one of the things I love the most about the college system at Cambridge, is you do have that much smaller circle within which you can develop closer relationships. Um, and that was fantastic. So a lot of my close friends were from my college, and meant you spent a lot of time together. Some of them were from within my program, other ones were not, which means you get a little bit more of that diversity. And then and then there was this group of mates from home who you can just like go back to normal, right? Like there's obviously like different parts of your personality and different, but you go back to sort of just like that much more low-key, relaxed approach that you inevitably take when you grow up in Botswana. And so I think it was a combination of those things, but it's one of the things I appreciated the most about the college system is you have a manageable number of people within which you'll inevitably meet people who you really get along with and who end up being very close.
Definitely. I really agree. Like I find I actually had a lot of friends from my course as well, just because I was at an all-female college. So I wanted to make sure that I still had friends who were male. But yeah, definitely your college, your course, and then all these little pockets of people that you can meet is great. But the college is obviously the one whole bunch of people that you'll meet every time you go for like breakfast, brunch, lunch, like dinner, like they're there, library. So it's great. And so talk to us more about your college. Downing is definitely, I feel like, one of the prettiest colleges at Cambridge. First of all, I guess, could you start by explaining Downing in a sentence for someone who's never been to Cambridge before?
Ooh, one sentence. Downing is somewhere in the middle on all fronts, is probably the best way I describe it. And I think that's a fantastic thing. As far as like age and tradition, it's not super, and this is often how it's described, it's like not super old. It's not very new. As far as size, it's also like slightly on the smaller size, but again, it's still have that a significant number of people in the college. As far as sort of diversity of like courses and nationalities and people who are in the college as well, I think it's a really good mix. So and it's in the middle of town, which is helpful.
That's such a great answer. Yeah, it's such a good way to put it. How is Downing different to the others in terms of, I guess, like accommodation, architecture, like the bunch of people there? What's the stereotypes that often hold up?
Oh, good question. Yeah, so as far as accommodation, one of the things I appreciated was like through all 3 years, you can stay pretty much on the campus. And so there were a bunch of houses that basically backed up onto the college. And so you always in and around that same area. There's a lot of space, which I mentioned my favorite spot was the paddock, which is just like a big square of grass in the middle of the college that you can chill on. And so that I really liked. There's a fantastic bar. I'd say it's as far, yeah. So I think like I describe it as relatively informal, pretty like chill environment with the things that you'd need around you as far as just like green space, decent places to live, a nice library. Like it's it has all the things you need to make it a bubble, which has pros and has cons. As far as the stereotypes, we had lots of lawyers. It's a big law college. We had a fair amount of tourists because it's really pretty, but it wasn't excessive. I'm trying to think what the other Downing stereotypes are.
I think for me, just from an outside of the college, there was a lot of geographers that went there just to the cafe
Yes,
because
that's also
it's like
true.
next to
Yeah,
that. It looks like an old Greek temple. That's
that's
a
such a
vibe.
great description of it. I completely agree. Yeah, I really liked that architecture. It's like it's it's pretty, but also a little bit more modern at the same time. It reminded me, yeah, like Yale's built very similarly, but I think it like, yeah, it has a good combination of like a grandioseness, but also a certain unassumingness, which I think epitomizes a lot of components of the college.
You were saying earlier that you knew you wanted to go to Downing from that conversation with your friend, but do you feel like your choice of college heavily affects your experience of like economics and of Cambridge?
I'd say it doesn't heavily affect my experience of economics. I'd say the one distinction is like supervisions, where like who you have your supervisions with and who you're exposed to makes a big difference. And so there were certain colleges, Jesus was one of them for development, but also more generally for economics, where a lot of the lecturers and a lot of the people you're interacting with on the faculty level are also based out of your college. And so you get a lot more exposure to them. That's valuable. So I'd say that's the one avenue in which it does affect your like degree experience, aside from how much you have to cycle to lectures. But beyond that, I don't feel like there was that big of a change, but I think it did affect my university experience. And I think it affected
Yeah.
my university experience in terms of like, yeah, who you surround yourself with, how you get to escape a little bit, what's important to you outside of, again, outside of your degree, right? Like
Yeah.
that, as much as we don't notice it, as much as we don't think we can achieve it, like that's such a big part of, at least for me in retrospect, that's the bigger part of what I remember.
And
um
and let's
yeah.
talk about the cycling bit.
Mm.
Where is like the economics degree like held, and what makes the Sidgewick side good or bad?
um yeah, so most of it, if it hasn't changed, is yeah, in the Sidgewick site. That's where we were most of our time, and it's got really bad lecture theaters that are not particularly comfortable, which is where we were for a lot of our lectures. So that was definitely one of the downsides. It was easy to access, which was nice, right? Like from college, it was, yeah, like a 5-6 minute bike ride. I always really enjoyed it as a just like fun way to split things out in your own head. With COVID, we're all about creating manufactured distinctions between different components of our life. That's one of them, where you have like some sort of distance to your lectures and back. I think it was convenient in the sense of you were there for most of your time, and so you could like you could stay there. The economics library is there, and you could sort of get all your lectures through, but then also stick around and do some work there. And that's where a lot of supervisions were held as well. So a lot of things are centered around the Sidgewick site. It's not the most, especially compared to the econ buildings there, especially compared to some of the other buildings there, like the law buildings, are not the most fancy things in the world. I'd say they're pretty utilitarian,
Yeah.
but they but they do the job, which is, yeah, which is sort of what you need. Um, yeah.
A good way to put it. Yeah. Yeah, I feel like for when you go to Sidgewick, you definitely admire the law faculty first.
Yeah.
But it's a good site to be in because like there's so many different courses that happen there. If you're thinking of doing one of the degrees, I would definitely recommend Selwyn or like Newnham, or just to be like or right next door to it if you can.
Exactly. Yeah, that's always valuable, especially when it's 5 to 9 and you've got a lecture in the morning and it's easy to get to. So that helps. And I think especially, I mean, we didn't have that many lectures. I can't remember what it was exactly now, but maybe in a day you'd have 3 or 4 lectures. And so it's, yeah, if there's cases in which you need to like come up and down, it becomes a little bit more valuable to be right next to it, as far as yeah, being able to head back to your house, head back to your college if you've got an hour off. Otherwise, you just have to impose yourself upon one of the nicer faculties and go and hang out in their libraries or cafes, which the law faculty often facilitated.
Definitely. Could you provide us with an overview of the economics degree at Cambridge and what you can be expected to learn there?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I'd, if I was to summarize it at a very high level in a couple of words, it's very strong on the quantitative side. And it can, towards the latter part, you can direct it in a few different directions depending on what you're keen on. So in the first year, you do, or I did, I'm not sure if it's changed. I don't think it's changed. Not much in the economics department changes. So you do 5 papers. There's a sort of quantitative maths and stats paper. There's a micro and a macro. And then there's a British economic, there's like a government and politics type paper based around the UK. And there's an economic history paper. And those last two are really strange. Those are things that I didn't think that I was going to be studying, and are very different to what you do in your like core quantitative papers. But I actually really enjoyed. They bring a very different perspective. They like, you get a little bit of that exposure to the political history side, very UK oriented, but you still like understand a little bit more about how things have progressed over time and policy. And British economic history is super fascinating, much more fascinating than, well, it's a little bit love it or hate it, but it was much more interesting than I thought. It allows you to do a little bit more of the writing of essays. It allows you to do a little bit more of the words instead of numbers. And it gives you a fascinating insight into just how industrial economies developed. So I'd say those two are rogue. At least I thought they were rogue, but surprisingly interesting when I was in my first year. And so those are the sort of 5 papers that you cover. In the second year, you get to choose one. So you have to do an econometrics, another micro, another macro. There's common themes here through all 3 years. And then you get to choose one as your 4th paper. So first year is generally very intense. Second year is the year where you have probably the most breathing space out of the 3 years, because you've got your 4 papers, you don't have to think about your dissertation. And so that's when you get to choose within the economics faculty. And so that's when I got to do like a development economics paper, or you can do a finance paper if you're interested. I think you can do more like quant mathsy stuff if you're interested. So that's where you get a little bit more choice. And then the third year is when you do your dissertation. And then you also do micro and macro, and then you get to choose your 2 other papers. So again, there you get a little bit more variety. Even within the micro and macro, over the course of the 3 years, it becomes more applicable to real life and like a little bit more interesting, to be honest. Which is, I guess, how most scientific subjects work, where you like learn the initial basics and then they tear things apart and tell you it was all a lie and talk to you a little bit more about how it actually applies in real life. And so in that second year, you get to choose 2 papers. And so again, I did another development paper, and then you get to do a couple more things which are more interesting and applied. I think I took one on industry and how like competition theory is done, and different elements of like regulating industry. But you can do, again, like more finance oriented papers if you like. There's a few more like hardcore mathsy papers again. So there's choice through those 3 years. And choice is generally limited to within the like econ faculty. And so the common themes, but I think I did enjoy a lot of especially within the development space, but I did enjoy a lot of the choices that I took. And then as far as dissertations, you have basically free range to think about a topic. So I did mine I was really keen to like do some research on back home, right? Like understand a little bit more about how some of these things apply to thinking about African economies, thinking about development. And so I did my dissertation on sort of regional integration on the continent and how that affects investment flows. And I think like, it's a cool opportunity. It's rough while you're doing it, because again, it's stressful and you have to do it in your spare time. And it feels, as much as it feels like an additional paper, you do have to like carve out time to work on it. But again, I think it's an enjoyable way to, one, build a deeper relationship with the supervisor, which I really value, as far as like you pick someone whose work you find interesting, you approach them to be your supervisor, and as long as you make that pitch appropriately, you get to learn a lot more off them. But then too, yeah, a chance to contextualize your work, to take what you've been doing and apply it in a much more real life way. So that was, I'd say, like those opportunities for some more flexibility. Even though I would have liked even more flexibility, especially when I was like saw what US programs look like. I think those I really enjoyed because you see the narrative, right? You see over the course of the 3 years how the things you learned in your first year feed into those in your second year, feed into those in your third year. And ultimately, by the time you reach your third year, I guess most people still sort of go into things where they don't necessarily use that, but there are applications of that, and you can start to see how that applies in life.
Definitely. And just going back to your point about the dissertation and the importance of like a good supervisor, I cannot stress that enough. Like planning a dissertation takes so much time during the summer of like second year to third year. And I think one of my biggest tip would definitely be to, yeah, not only approach a supervisor that you like enjoy the work of, but also make sure that like that supervisor is supporting you on your journey and you're getting actual feedback. Because I do not remember my dissertation with great like emotion because I do feel like I didn't get enough feedback. So
Yeah, that's such a good point. And I think I agree. I mean, everyone says start it early because then you have time to do it. But I think the bigger benefit of starting it early is you also have time to enjoy it more, right? Like you have time to, with the right guidance, which is exactly what you said, you have time to dig deeper into what you're doing and why you want to do it, as opposed to it just being like, man, I have to get through this thing and I hate it. And I
yeah.
was like, I didn't get to it until pretty late. And so even though I chose an interesting topic, like
What was your topic?
it was basically like digging into different like regional trade groups. So similar to, I mean, the EU is like the biggest regional trade group, right? But there's a lot of ones in across Africa. So there's a lot of like sub-regional ones in Southern Africa and West Africa and East Africa. And recently there's been an African Free Trade Agreement launched, which sort of brings them all together. And so it's just
Yeah.
understanding, there's a lot of research done on like how that affects trade flows, but there was also a part of that which I wanted to dig into around how that affects investments coming in and interest in these different countries and how to leverage that. So it was a super fascinating topic, but because I didn't get started on it until pretty late, and I struggled to find data, which is another big part for an economics dissertation. Make sure
Yeah.
you do something where some data is actually available, otherwise it will be the biggest pain. By the time I ended it, I was just like, I want this to be done. But I think if you do start it early, if you do pick a topic right, then it's a fun experience. It's just like a really interesting exposure to the research world and allows you to broaden much beyond what's part of a traditional degree.
Definitely. And as much as a dissertation can be a fun and like happy experience if you go through it the correct way, do you remember what was like your happiest experience at Cambridge or your happiest day at Cambridge?
Oh, so in first year, economists are the last people to write their exams, and it's painful. And so I think one of my happiest days in Cambridge was that final day when you close out that final exam. You finish off your first year. It's everybody else is done. You like have maybe to look forward to. I still remember that day as, yeah, just like it's a really cool moment where you reflect and you're like, whoa, that was hard. You're also like, that was fun. And it was a fascinating confluence of all things Cambridge. Where you're like going to these random garden parties and very Cambridgey things. You've just been through this serious ringer over the last 3 to 4 months, and probably the hardest thing that I'd ever done until that point. You have some of these like really cool things to look forward to. It's sunny, so that was one of my best memories of Cambridge, which is sort of, I guess, only tangentially related to academia. I think one of the most, like, as far as within the degree, I think the things that I enjoyed the most were the supervisions. I think that, like, if you're interested in the subjects and if you get a good supervisor and you're willing to engage, I think, again, like, that was the moments where you got to go beyond the day-to-day. You got to go beyond, like, I need to memorize this to pass my exam, and you got to talk a little bit more about, like, well, what does it all mean? So yeah, so those are two plus May Week is obviously a third that I think stand out as very, very good memories for me from that whole period.
Definitely. And I will say that this is the first time that I've heard supervisions mentioned as an answer for this question. But, you know, it's great. And it is the most unique part about Cambridge and, like, the whole education system there. So no, it is enjoyable when you look back at it, not when you're, like, in the middle of it being interrogated by a professor.
Exactly. And I think the annoying thing is it's so dependent on who you are with, where for some people it's very clear that they dislike it as much as you do, and then it's not fun for anyone. But with selected ones, I really enjoyed them. I mean, it's fun talking. It's fun talking about interesting things. So it's hit and miss, but it is, as you said, just like a very distinct part of the experience. Yeah, I think the last thing I'd say, and I've said this a few times before, but I think it's worth reiterating, especially within the economics world and the Cambridge economics world, is just an encouragement and a nudge if you're thinking about doing this to think beyond what you're pushed to do, right? Like, if I look at most of the cohort, if I look at most of the conversations, there is a very standard direction, and a lot of that direction is going into sort of the consulting and the finance sector, and I think that's great. And there's a lot of reasons for that. But I think one of the things that I definitely didn't realize, and I picked up a lot more when I was in the US as opposed to in the UK, is how many other things you can do with that knowledge. And I think like what I'm doing now is it's sort of why I like it is because it's a dream combination of, like, using what I studied and applying it to something that has a little bit more social impact. But I think more generally, I think the world in which the number of opportunities and options you have are much bigger than what you're led to believe while you're studying, and what you think about or talk about on a daily basis. And I think that's something I just encourage people going into this to do. Like I said, keep the bigger picture in mind right from the very beginning. Use as many of the resources that you can to understand what that broader world of opportunities looks like, and think about it more holistically. That's not to say don't go into sector X, Y, and Z, but just sort of know your options, because Cambridge opens a lot of doors, and it opens a lot of really, really special and impactful doors too. And so I think that that's something that doesn't get enough attention during the time you're there, and because you're so busy and because you sort of just have these simple objectives in mind. But it's something that definitely would have changed both how I approached my degree, as far as the, like, trying to use it more holistically, as well as my understanding of what I could do with that degree. So there's a career fair happening next week that Cambridge is holding. I think it's called Work to Change the World. And, like, the whole premise of that is, opportunities within the public and the social sector. And I remember, like, I'm going to be presenting one of the things about ID Insight at that fair next week. But I remember going to that fair while I was there and just seeing not that many options. ID Insight wasn't there. There are a lot of other things that I know about now that weren't there then. And I think that there's so much more scope to put those options out there. And that's the most important thing. It's just understanding what you could do and knowing the pros and cons of that, and then making the decision that makes sense is an approach that I found in retrospect really, really valuable. So that's something to check out too.
Well, thank you so much, Krishna, for telling us all about, like, your journey and career trajectory as well, from Botswana to the UK, the US, and now Zambia. I'm sure everyone will enjoy listening about your stories from econ and Downing. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
No problem. Thanks for having me. This is fun. It's a fantastic initiative, and I'm glad you had me on.
Hi everyone. Thanks for listening to this latest episode of the Oxford and Cambridge project. If you enjoyed this episode, why not give it a like, a share, or subscribe to our page, as this really helps people find our podcast.